I don't know about you, but I have this nagging feeling that what's been happening in Ukraine going back to November of 2013 when the protests began, we're not getting the real story. We've been led to believe that this was a populist uprising, pitting ordinary impoverished Ukrainians against a corrupt and brutal regime. And there was that YouTube video that went viral, I'm Ukrainian, featuring a beautiful young Ukrainian protester pleading for the West to help Ukrainians fight for democracy. Well, it turns out that was a giant PR hoax with ties to the Council on Foreign Relations. So I thought, let's find out what's really going on over there before it's too late. And to shed some much-needed clarity on the situation, I've enlisted an old friend of the program. Webster Tarpley is one of the most incisive critics of Anglo-American hegemony. As an activist historian, is best known for his book, George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography, a masterpiece of research which is still a must-read. He's a 9/11 Truth Scholar, an activist, summa cum laude and a Phi Beta Kappa, Fulbright Scholar at University of Turin, Italy, an M.A. in Humanities from Skidmore College. He's fluent in Italian, German, French, Latin, and Russian. I could go on. But here, with no further ado. Webster Tarpley, how are you, my friend?
Thank you, Richard. It's good to talk to you.
Listen, the recent events in the Ukraine, the tragic events in Ukraine, have been portrayed in the West by the media, let's say, as essentially a populist uprising, everyday, ordinary Ukrainians protesting, pitted against some evil, corrupt, government. You see things in an entirely different light, I know. Give me your version and break it down for us in simple and easy to understand terms.
Well, people may remember 10 years ago there was the Orange Revolution in Kiev, Ukraine, and that led to the creation of a government that tried rather hard to be a NATO puppet state, but didn't quite succeed. But that had all the trappings of a typical color revolution with slogans and colors and trendy kids camping on the square and so forth. This time around, it's much uglier because the dominant forces, I'm afraid, in this Maidan or Euromaidan, the occupation of the main square, have from the very beginning been in traditions, coming from traditions which we could only call fascist, or in some cases they go back to the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. And in particular, the tradition that is very much alive in one of them is a group called Right Sector. And the Right Sector is really right. I'll tell you something more about them. But their tradition is a guy called Stepan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian who went to work for the Nazi SS and waged war against the Soviets, and then took refuge in Munich, where he worked for Radio Free Europe, and according to some accounts, he directed what they would call guerrilla warfare, what we might call terrorism today. So if we look just to get to the current situation, right, the background is, of course, absolutely critical, but right now you have a government that it seems to be dominated by the friends of Yulia Tymoshenko, the blonde woman that you saw getting out of jail over this past weekend. Yulia Tymoshenko, the gas princess, right? Your typical
former
blonde,
prime minister of Ukraine.
Former prime minister. She was the big beneficiary of the Orange Revolution. She's a kleptocrat. She's the gas princess, and she counts as an oligarch. She's a multi-millionaire in the hundreds of millions, or indeed a billionaire. And then she's got her two key men there that she controls. One is the prime minister, this guy Yatsenyuk, and of course Yatsenyuk is the one we heard Victoria Nuland of the U.S. State Department, right, in her famous foul-mouthed telephone call. She talked about yachts, and yachts is this Yatsenyuk, right, bald head and glasses. And then the president of the country, or the interim president, they call him, Turchinov. He's another friend of Tymoshenko. So they're all from this thing called the Fatherland Party. The other guy you've probably seen is this very tall, very big heavyweight boxer. He's, according to some accounts, he is the heavyweight boxing champion of the world right now, Klitschko. And his party is called Udar. And Udar, appropriately enough, means the punch. So he's from the punch party. I'm afraid this poor guy has got, he's taken too many hits to the head. He seems to be a punch-drunk palooka who can hardly put two sentences together.
Okay, but
let
me stop you there for a minute and remind listeners Webster Tarpley is with us, author, historian, and a critic of U.S. foreign policy. His website, tarpley.net, Tarpley.net, and you can read all his latest dispatches on the situation in Ukraine. I mean, this is not to suggest that there weren't legitimate protesters in Kiev with legitimate grievances, but you're saying that this whole movement has been, once again, as we've seen, history repeating itself, this movement has been co-opted by these far-right, some might say neo-Nazi groups.
Yes, and I'm afraid this entire thing was much darker from the very beginning. It was, it didn't have this, upbeat, happy young people on a spree overtone. This was always rather sinister. So you have this fatherland party of Timoshenko at the Gas Princess. You got the punch party of this poor guy who's taken too many punches, and then you get the really ugly ones. The first one is called Svoboda, freedom. And Svoboda is led by a guy called Chanibok. And Chanibok appears in all the academic studies of European neo-fascism. He's in there because of he's got a long track record of statements. He hates Jews above all. He is an anti-Semite. He hates Poles. He hates Russians perhaps more than any of these.
Wait a minute, though. Wasn't U.S. Senator John McCain up on a stage posing with members of Svoboda?
Yes, Chanibok, and it's absolutely outrageous. I have a friend who did a meme based on that photograph, and you see McCain thinking, "Boy, if Americans were this dumb, I'd be president." So, yes, McCain, of course, goes into these situations from the hip. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know who he's meeting. And indeed, he met some people who are even worse. So Svoboda we might call the moderate fascist tradition, perhaps, with this Chanibok. But he's also got the interior minister. If you woke up on Saturday morning and heard that the Ukrainian interior minister had warned that an invasion of the country was going on, you might wonder who is the interior minister. And that guy, Avakov, is a jailbird. He was held in Rome by the Italian police, kept in jail for some days, weeks, as a result of an Interpol warrant for his arrest for crimes of real estate corruption and related stuff. So this is a very mixed group. So Svoboda is already ideologically of this type, and then we get the most extreme group, which is the right sector. And here I would just call your attention to two. One is Yarosh, and Yarosh is someone who over the weekend put out a call to the Chechen terrorist organization of Doku Umarov. This is these people are terrorists in the U.S. catalog, the British catalog, everybody's catalog. And he said, now the Chechens, we fought for you. We came to fight for you in your war against the Russians, and even since. And now we want you to join us because we need your help against the Russians. So
okay, let me just jump in here, Webster.
Webster
will take a timeout. We'll come back and we'll continue to delve in this tragic situation unfolding in Ukraine, where it appears some rather unsavory, to say the least, characters have taken the reins of power. Back with more of the Conspiracy Show. Stay with us. Webster Tarpley, tarpley.net. If you just go to the homepage at richardsyrett.com and click on Webster's name, that'll take you right to his website. Now, let's just back up a little.
Maybe one more name. I know it's too many names, but just in this right sector, we did Yarosh. Yarosh is the guy who, according to the website, his website put out a call to these Chechen terrorists to join in the fight. Now, the press secretary of this right sector said, "Oh no, this was hacked in. We didn't really do that." But it's really academic because they have a prominent leader, the guy called Muzycho, Muzychcho. He is documented as having gone to Chechnya during the 1990s and has fought with these terrorists alongside them against the Russians. And he even gives you a catalog. He says, "I destroyed 4 tanks, 3 armored personnel carriers, 5 trucks, and 2 artillery pieces," and so forth. So he is on record as being part of a terrorist army. So I think this is interesting from the point of view of people here in North America. The people who blew up the Boston Marathon are indeed, some of them, their friends, the ones they pal around with and mutually support themselves. Those are a key part of what's going on in Kiev. And remember, this group, this Maidan, was 20 to 30,000 at the very most, right? On weekends, of course, in a holiday atmosphere, they could get a couple of 100,000 people to come out, right? But Kiev is a city in the many millions, and Ukraine has something like 50 million. So 20,000 extremists, and you've seen them, right? These are street fighters, people throwing Molotov bottles, a very interesting dramatic film from about 10 days ago of a
Right.
Ukrainian police armored personnel carrier being just overwhelmed by Molotov cocktails, policemen being burned alive, policemen being beaten, policemen captured, and indeed members of the army captured by these people. So this is not peaceful, this is violent, and it's got nothing to do with democracy. There are no demands of democracy.
No.
There's no such thing. The demands
Webster,
are suppress the use of Russian and fire Yanukovych.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Yanukovych, the deposed president. Now, he has been portrayed as this corrupt official. We saw the Ukrainians gleefully marching on his presidential palace, and the Western media was making a big deal about his collection of cars and antiques and a labyrinth of escape tunnels and so forth. And I was thinking to myself, watching that, wait a minute, that's the official resident of the president. The members,
Yes,
that were part of the Orange Revolution would have lived there and had the same.
And this Yushchenko probably lived there if the place was acquired in time, right? Yushchenko, along with Timoshenko, those were the 2 darlings of the Orange Revolution installed by NATO.
But so was Yanukovych? Was he corrupt? Was he
Sure,
everything?
He was corrupt. But
Yeah.
you have to remember that the country is a post-Soviet place, right? So what happened in 1990 to 1991, in a nutshell, was the oligarchy of each individual Union Republic, and there were 16, played the nationalities card to remain in power as an oligarchy. The technical term is nomenklatura, right? That's the Russian term, or the old Russian term for oligarchy. Now they just call themselves oligarchs. So Yanukovych is very definitely one of them, and I hold no brief for him. My name for him is Chicken Kiev. He is the real Chicken Kiev because of his cowardice and vacillation. He could have essentially cleared the square in November or December or in January sometime, and that would have been the end of it. Right? It reminds me of the famous moment when Mussolini's fascists are marching on Rome. One of the leading generals, General Badoglio, turns to the king and says, "Your Majesty, 5 minutes of gunfire and fascism will be over." And of course, the king didn't want that. He wanted Mussolini, but that is the way it is with these fascist movements. The thing behind Yanukovych is that he was surrounded by these oligarchs. One of the oligarchs, the richest, put out a statement in the last week or so saying, "We have to have a peaceful solution, no bloodshed, no crackdown," right? And you were dealing with things that would have been crushed in any country of the world, right? Again, burning policemen, burning police cars, burning army trucks, occupying government buildings, and rather important ones,
Right.
burning down the trade union building. That's an interesting one because it shows how right-wing these people are. There was another oligarch who was sort of in the middle, not really pro-Yanukovych, not against him. and he's part of this. There's a guy called Pinchuk. He's a great friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton. This guy has given $5 million to the Clinton Global Initiative, so we can assume that he was counseling, a soft line, right? In other words, it's the appeasement of fascism, and unfortunately, people have to remember these painful lessons. Appeasement of fascism doesn't work. They simply escalate. One other guy is important. There's a guy called Poroshenko, who is a chocolate manufacturer, candy manufacturer. He is an oligarch. He's a multi-billionaire. And this is the guy who paid the stipends for the people in Maidan, because they were not there on their own dime. They were getting, the humblest of them was getting $25 a day from, we think, Poroshenko. They were certainly getting this money.
Okay, well, that
Poroshenko...
That brings us to another issue. And let me go back to that famous YouTube video that went viral. And, of course, it's the I Am Ukrainian, this beautiful woman. She looks like a fashion model standing in the square in Kiev saying, look what is happening to my country. Please help us, and so forth. And then later reports were that was produced. I thought the lighting was a little too good, but it was produced supposedly by this huge PR firm. What can you tell us about who was behind not only the making of that video and this publicity campaign, but also who else was behind, or who else is behind these neo-Nazis that are taking over in Ukraine?
Well, we can be pretty sure. There's not a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's lots of circumstantial, but not so much detailed stuff. This is the U.S. NATO color revolution apparatus, but again, it's moved itself into a more sinister light because of the fact that this was violent from the word go, and there were always guns and so forth, and the content was always this. You can call the content anti-Semitic, racist, pro-terrorist because of the connections to these Chechens, and indeed this fascist tradition of Stepan Bandera, right? The darling above all of the right sector. So that's all there. You can see the connections into some of these oligarchs through the Clintons. We can be sure that this was part of the apparatus telling Yanukovych, don't do anything. And then you have the role of the Europeans, and this is actually very interesting. One of the problems with Yanukovych is that he capitulated, he surrendered repeatedly. At the beginning of February, he went on sick leave, and he tried to bring the leaders of the protests into the government. He offered Yatsenyuk and a couple of others the prime ministership if they wanted it, with so the Yanukovych as president and these other guys as the government, right? The government in the European sense of the prime minister and the other ministers, and they wouldn't do that. But then later on, he made other capitulations, and in the course of this, it emerged that they weren't interested in reforms. This was very similar to Syria, right? The main demand was Assad out, Yanukovych out, but he repeatedly demoralized his own base by giving in to these people. And in the last phase, we had a deal signed, about 2 weeks ago right now. And in that deal, there was going to be an amnesty for everybody if they left the square in the government buildings. And that was implemented by Yanukovych. But the people in the square then said, well, we'll leave here, but we'll go and seize the parliament, and we'll go and seize the other government buildings. So that was that night of the bonfires, right? The most surreal was the Tuesday to Wednesday.
And then we had the snipers on buildings, shooting police snipers.
Yeah, and again, you don't know who those snipers are, but it's pretty clear that they're not only from one side, right? That they're from different sides. So at this point, his support collapsed because you had 67 cops who had been taken prisoner, you had army troops who had been taken prisoner and their lives were in danger, and then Yanukovych wanted to negotiate again. And here, this is my point that I wanted to get to, is the people who whispered in his ear were Chancellor Merkel of Germany called up Yanukovych and said, you've got to negotiate. And she said, I'm sending my foreign minister. We're going to have some foreign ministers come in, and they're going to broker a deal. And apparently this awful woman, Catherine Ashton, Baroness Ashton of the European Union Foreign Affairs lady, she was also on the phone with a similar siren song. So in they go with Steinmeier, the foreign minister of Germany, Fabius, the foreign minister of France, and Sikorski of the famous family, the oligarch, foreign minister of Poland. Sikorski's wife is actually a columnist here for the Washington Post. So these the three foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Poland, came in and sat down with the demonstrators, the rebels, the terrorists, whatever we want to call them, and Yanukovych, and they had a deal, which was elections in December and other things that these the protesters, so-called, signed off on. And at that point, the police forces melted away. They simply couldn't. They had lost confidence in Yanukovych. This was sort of a week ago Friday. A week ago this past Friday afternoon, the police just hightailed it, right? They took French leave. They departed from the scene. And that meant that there was no police cordon around Yanukovych's presidential building,
forcing him to flee.
And at that point, we had Yarosh and these other people. There's one extremist of the Maidan group whose trademark is that he carries a pitchfork with him at all times. So they were getting up a week ago Friday evening saying, we're going to go to the presidential building tomorrow at 10 o'clock, and if Yanukovych is still there, he's going to be in big trouble. So you can see that there was a direct intervention by Germany, France, Poland. There are all sorts of stories about how Sweden is trying to reassert a sphere of influence in these areas. Remember, there were Baltic nobles in Sweden who at one point had estates in Lithuania, maybe, and some of those maybe included or not so far from Ukraine. So all of this horrendous stuff from the Middle Ages is essentially coming back.
Okay, let me.
That's the apparatus that did it. That's what kept him, so he wouldn't do anything.
Webster Tarpley is with us, historian, author, and harsh critic of U.S. foreign policy, tarpley.net, the website. Let me ask you, ostensibly this, going back to November, this was about the fact that the Ukrainian government was trying to forge ties, or they backed away from a closer ties with the EU, and they wanted to forge closer ties with Moscow. That's what we're told. This is how it all started. What's it really about? Is this about the NATO intelligence and the West trying to install their own puppet or drive a wedge between Russia and the Ukraine? What's this really? What's at the heart of this?
Well, concerning this negotiation with the European Union, they were not being offered membership. Membership was never offered to them. They were always going to be, according to one commentator, they were going to be getting a worse deal than countries in Africa were getting, even though Ukraine is actually a European country. So the deal was very bad. What was the deal? The way it works in Ukraine is the big issue is heating because it's so cold, right? So you have to get natural gas. The natural gas is sold by Russia to Ukraine under a deal signed by Tymoshenko, the gas princess, before she went to jail when she was still prime minister. She signed a deal with Putin that gives Ukraine a reasonable price, right? This is supposed to be dependent on reasonable behavior, right? If you want a political price, then fulfill the political conditions. And then the Ukrainian government resells to individuals and consumers at a lower price. So they have a subsidy. They have a gas subsidy. It's like what you find in Egypt or Syria or places like this, where there's a bread subsidy and a cooking oil subsidy and a heating and cooking,
right,
methane or mazout or whatever, these kinds of subsidies. So Ukraine has this too. The first demand, the International Monetary Fund, which superintended these talks, not just the EU, but the full troika, meaning the International Monetary Fund was there too. They said you're going to have to abolish those subsidies. This is impossible. Then they said you have to cut pensions for old people. You've got to cut medical care for old people. You've got to cut aid for children. You've got to devalue the currency. And in other words, an entire brutal, genocidal, deflationary austerity program of the worst type, of the type that has failed again and again and again. In other words, they were going to get the Greek treatment and
right,
then some.
Right.
So and again, not even being a member, right? You won't even get membership. And the idea was that the dumping would begin. European goods could be dumped in Ukraine. Ukraine would not get any benefits. This was a deal that nobody could love, except a NATO agent who was also steeped in the school of Stepan Bandera and the Nazis from the 1940s. So,
all right, I got to jump in here, Webster. Got to jump in. We'll take another time out. We come back. I want to talk about now the Russians rolling into Crimea and what whether we are in fact on the precipice of potentially a world war. What's going on? We'll take that up with Webster Tarpley on the other side here on the Conspiracy Show. Don't go away. We're back with a final segment with Webster Tarpley. Tarpley.net is his website, and Webster.
Richard, we have one question left over, if I could, from the previous time. What is it really about? Well, it's geopolitics, right? If you're Napoleon, if you're Hitler, whoever you are, you want to invade, you have to go through here, right? If you want to invade Russia, Ukraine is there, and you've got to go across Ukraine, pretty much. Now, that I don't think is the immediate plan, but then there's this question of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is giving NATO such a hard time, right? The idea that Russia can have warships show off at Tartus, say in Syria, and contest the Mediterranean as a NATO lake. Well, it's not, as long as the Russians can come in, which they do at various points in the Syrian crisis, and they ship in weapons and all sorts of things. So the idea that in particular the Crimea and those ports is a part of Ukraine. Of course, this is historically not the case, right? This was Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, in a moment of idiocy, decided he wasn't popular enough in Ukraine, even though that's more or less where he came from. He said, "I'll gratify the Ukrainians. I'll give them this under their administration, and then they'll be bigger and they'll like me more." This was really, really dumb. But he was a populist, so he did it. But of course, historically speaking, there's no question of Ukraine. There has been no Ukraine, right? Ukraine is historically important for Russia, because the beginning of Christianity in Russia is in 988. The Grand Duke of Ukraine, right, the Rurik, converted to Orthodox Christianity, and that is the so-called Kiev Rus, and that survived until about 1240 or so, with the coming of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. So there was an independent Ukraine from the 900s, and even earlier, until about the middle of the 1200s. But then after that, they go under the Mongol yoke, and they don't come out for several centuries. And when they do, it's the Russian Empire that brings them out. But later, they're, of course, split. The Ukraine of today was split among Russia, to be sure, but also among Poland. Poland was a very big country. It went from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, included a lot of this. And also Austria getting this area of Galicia, even Romania.
All right, so given Russia's obvious, the strong history in this region, what was Obama thinking, drawing this pink line in the sand, if we can call it that, telling Putin that he has no business rolling into Crimea or the Ukraine?
Well, on Friday afternoon, I was relieved. I laughed and laughed when I saw that appearance by Obama. I thought that was the most transparent, pro forma attempt to get out of a terrible situation. I don't think Obama is the worst. Right? I think there are a lot of very foolish websites that want to tell you that Obama is the evil demiurge and so forth. I don't even think they wake him up for these things. He could stop it if he wanted to, and he doesn't. So that's his responsibility. But in terms of doing this stuff, I would say this is a color revolution, neocon, neo-fascist, CIA, MI6, BND, DGSE operation that just goes on. And if you want that to stop, you've got to shut them down. In other words, you've got to defund them, break them up, and I would be all for doing that. But when Obama showed up at the White House on Friday and said there will be costs, what he means by costs is that he won't go to the G8. And of course, the reason you can tell this is you have these godforsaken U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and the only way they're getting out of there with their equipment is thanks to the Russian railways put at their disposition by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, Without that, they're going to have a Dunkirk retreat. They're going to get out of there with their shirts if they're lucky, but nothing else, right? So all of that equipment, tens of billions of dollars of equipment that's sitting in Afghanistan is going to stay there unless they can take it up to the Russian railheads and send it back over the Russian railway system into Europe. So I don't think anything like that is happening. On the other hand, some of these people are crazy, right? Susan Rice is crazy. Samantha Power, the loopy one, right? The wife of Cass Sunstein of the Cognitive Infiltration Group. She's obviously mad as a hatter, right? She's mad as a March hare.
Got about 20 seconds here, Webster.
And Kerry, right? I think Kerry should be fired immediately. If you wonder why Kerry is such a fascist sympathizer, maybe his wife is part of the picture. She grew up under Salazar fascism in Portugal, and maybe she's nostalgic for that. I often think that she is. So I would say the big thing is stay out of it. There's no Canadian interest, no U.S. interest. There's no Western interest in Ukraine. It's part of the Russian sphere. They should learn to have reasonable governments. They should accept a kind of Finlandization if it comes to that, right?
All right.
Finland did very well under that. They could too.
All right. Webster Tarpley, thank you so much for this. Tarpley.net. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Richard. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.